There is a moment in Game of Thrones when two guests at a feast realize, too late, that the hospitality they accepted was a death sentence. The music stops. The doors close. The killing begins. George R. Martin has acknowledged that the Red Wedding was inspired by Scottish history, specifically by an event that took place in 1440 in the Great Hall of a castle that today receives over 2 million tourists a year, sells its image on shortbread tins, and is described in official tourism literature as the beating heart of Scottish national identity. The Black Dinner. Two teenage boys. A child king who watched and could not stop it. A severed bull's head placed on the table as a death signal. And then, the executioner. The real story is darker than the fiction. Because in the fiction, at least, the killers had a reason. Or in Edinburgh Castle in 1440, the boys who died were killed not out of political necessity, but out of naked greed, by men who used a child king as cover for a murder that made them rich. That child king grew up. What he did next changed Scotland permanently. But before we get to the Black Dinner, we need to understand what kind of place Edinburgh Castle actually is. Because the castle sold to you on tourist posters, the ancient Scottish stronghold, unconquered, the proud symbol of national identity, is not the castle that history records. The castle that history records has been taken multiple times, garrisoned by the English for longer than most people realize, used as a prison, a weapons depot, and an instrument of colonial administration. Its crown jewels were locked in a room and forgotten for 111 years. This is Edinburgh Castle, and not the symbol. The place. Chapter 1. The Rock Before the Castle, 900 BC to 1093 AD. The rock on which Edinburgh Castle stands is approximately 350 million years old. This matters for understanding the castle because the castle is not primarily a feat of human engineering. It is a feat of geology. The castle rock is the solidified core of a volcano that last erupted in the Carboniferous period, when what is now Scotland was located near the equator and surrounded by shallow tropical seas. The magma that filled the volcanic vent cooled into a particularly hard dolerite. The ice sheets of successive glaciations ground away the softer sedimentary rock around it, but could not grind away the dolerite plug. What was left after 300 million years of erosion was a steep-sided crag rising 130 meters above the surrounding ground on three sides, and with a gentler slope approaching from the east, the ridge that would become the Royal Mile. No military engineer in history could have designed a more defensible position in a populated lowland landscape. The three steep sides are essentially unclimbable in full armor. The single accessible approach from the east could be blocked by a relatively small garrison. The summit commands views across the Firth of Forth to the north, across the Pentland Hills to the south, across the lowland plains in every direction. Any hostile force approaching from any direction would be visible to the garrison for hours before it arrived. Human beings understood this before recorded history. Archaeological evidence places settlement on the Castle Rock as far back as 900 BC, the Bronze Age. Iron Age peoples fortified it. The Romans, who never permanently occupied what is now Scotland, knew of the rock and documented it. The Votadini, a Brittonic people who controlled southeast Scotland in the centuries around the Roman period, maintained a major settlement on the rock they called Din Iden, from which the name Edinburgh eventually derives. What Din Iden looked like, what structures stood on the rock before the medieval period, is largely unknown. The geology that made the rock defensible also made it a continuously occupied site. Each new phase of construction obliterated or buried the previous one. The Castle Rock has been built on so continuously for so long that archaeology can only reach the earlier periods in the few places where later construction has not disturbed the ground. what archaeology has recovered is fragmentary and contested. Since there are traces of structures from the Iron Age, circular hut platforms, evidence of metalworking, material culture consistent with a significant settlement. The Votadini used the rock as one of several fortified hilltop centres across southeast Scotland, a pattern common to Iron Age peoples who combined defensive positioning with symbolic statements of territorial control. The rock was not just a military position, it was an assertion of presence, of ownership, of belonging to this particular landscape. The Romans encountered the Votadini and reached a working relationship with them that was more complex than simple conquest or simple resistance. The Votadini appear in Roman documents. Their name, Latinized, is recorded by Ptolemy in the 2nd century. Archaeological evidence suggests they traded with Roman Britain, adopted certain Roman material culture, and were sometimes used as a buffer state between Roman territory and the tribes further north that Rome never successfully subdued. The rock at Din Aden was not a Roman installation, but it existed in a political landscape shaped by Roman presence. After the Roman withdrawal from Britain in the early 5th century, the Votadini territory fragmented. The Brittonic kingdoms of the north, small successor states to the tribal confederacies of the Roman period, competed among themselves and faced pressure from Pictish peoples to the north, Gaelic Scots from Ireland to the west, and eventually Anglo-Saxon advance from the south. Din Aden passed out of Votadini control, probably in the 7th century, when the Northumbrian kingdom of the Angles captured it from the Brittonic kingdom of Gododin. So it is in this period that the famous Welsh poem Why Gododin was composed, lamenting a catastrophic raid south from Din Aden by a warband of Brittonic warriors who were destroyed. The poem is one of the earliest substantial texts in any surviving British language, and its connection to what is now Edinburgh is among the most remarkable threads in the castle's deep history. Northumbrian control of the rock was itself temporary. As Northumbria weakened and the Kingdom of Alba, the predecessor of Scotland, expanded southward in the 9th and 10th centuries, the rock and the territory around it were absorbed into the Scottish kingdom. By the 10th century, Edinburgh was in Scotland. By the 11th century, it was a royal centre. What is certain is that by the early medieval period, the rock was a significant royal centre. So the Edinburgh known to the early Scottish kings, the dynasty that emerged from the Kingdom of Alba in the 9th and 10th centuries and gradually absorbed or conquered the other peoples of what is now Scotland, used the rock as a fortress and occasional residence. It was not the only royal fortress in Scotland, and not always the most important. Stirling Castle controlled the crossing of the Forth. Perth was a significant administrative centre. The Scottish kingdom in this period was peripatetic. Kings moved between centres, holding court wherever they were, without the fixed capital structure that later states developed. The first building on the Castle Rock, whose existence is historically documented rather than archaeologically inferred, is the chapel that bears the name of St. Margaret. Margaret was the English-born wife of King Malcolm III. Malcolm Canmore, the king who ended Macbeth's reign, the king whose story Shakespeare dramatized, though with substantial freedom from historical fact. Margaret was a woman of extraordinary religious devotion and political influence. She reformed the Scottish Church in the direction of continental Catholic practice. She founded religious houses. She was canonized in 1250. The chapel named for her, the oldest surviving building in Edinburgh and one of the oldest surviving buildings in Scotland, was probably built not by Margaret herself, but in her memory, possibly by her son David I in the early 12th century. It is a small, plain Romanesque structure of remarkable simplicity. A nave and a chancel, stone walls, round arches. It has survived everything that the castle around it has endured over 9 centuries, because it is small enough to be easily maintained and robust enough to resist damage. Margaret herself died in 1093 in the castle 4 days after learning that her husband had been killed in battle near Alnwick. The sources describe her as already ill and as being devastated by the news. She was carried out of the castle by her sons through the besieging forces of her brother-in-law, Donald Bain, who was seizing the throne, and taken for burial at Dunfermline. The castle she died in was already, in the year of her death, being fought over by competing claimants to the Scottish throne. This is the pattern that will repeat for the next 6 centuries. Edinburgh Castle is not a place of stability. It is a place of contested power. Dr. C. Ian McIvor spent his career as Principal Inspector of Ancient Monuments for Scotland and produced the most detailed architectural study of Edinburgh Castle. His assessment of the early period was characteristically precise. We know remarkably little about Edinburgh Castle before the 12th century that goes beyond general inference. The rock was certainly occupied and certainly fortified. The reasons for this are obvious to anyone who stands on it. But the specific structures, the specific events, the specific political significance, the record is thin. What the rock represents in this early period is potential. The potential for domination of the surrounding landscape. That potential would be systematically realized from the 12th century onward, by Scottish kings first, and then, for long periods, by the English. By the time of Margaret's death in 1093, the pattern was established. The rock commanded. Whoever held the rock commanded the surrounding lowlands. Whoever commanded the surrounding lowlands held a significant portion of the kingdom. Edinburgh Castle would spend the next 8 centuries being fought over by exactly the people who understood this. Chapter 2. The English Castle in Scotland, 1093 to 1313. Here is the fact that Scottish tourist literature handles with considerable delicacy. For significant periods of the medieval era, including the formative years when the castle was developing into the structure that defines the Edinburgh skyline, Edinburgh Castle was an English fortress, garrisoned by English soldiers, administered by English officials, held in the name of the English crown. Used as the administrative and military centre of English royal power in southern Scotland. This is not a minor footnote. It lasted, in aggregate, for decades, and it shaped what the castle is. Before the catastrophe of 1286, Edinburgh Castle had served the Scottish kings reasonably well, and without particular drama. The 12th century was a period of Scottish royal consolidation. David I, who reigned from 1124 to 1153, was one of the most capable kings Scotland ever had, extending the kingdom, founding religious houses, importing Norman administrative practices, and generally transforming what had been a somewhat chaotic Celtic kingdom into a more recognizable feudal state. Edinburgh was one of several royal castles David used, alongside Stirling, Dunfermline, and others. The royal court moved between them seasonally, following the rhythms of administration and hunting and the practical need to consume the food renders from different parts of the kingdom rather than transporting everything to a single center. The castle in this period was a working royal installation. It housed the king's household when he was there. It stored weapons and treasure. It served as a center of justice. It was also, continuously, being improved. The great tower that dominated the castle's eastern face, David's Tower, named for the 12th century king, was built in stages over the 12th and 13th centuries and became the primary residential and defensive structure of the medieval castle. It was demolished by English artillery in 1573, and the Half-Moon Battery was built on its ruins. The tower that defined Edinburgh Castle for 3 centuries is gone. What replaced it is the ruin's ruin. The succession of competent Scottish kings, David I, Malcolm IV, William I, Alexander II, Alexander III, maintained the castle without incident, and kept the English at manageable distance through a combination of military capability, diplomatic skill, and the strategic cultivation of English allies within the Scottish nobility. The Scottish kingdom was not independent of English influence in this period, But it was not subordinate to it either. It maintained its own institutions, its own church, its own legal traditions, while adapting Norman practices in ways that strengthened royal authority. Alexander III was the last of this competent succession. His reign, from 1249 to 1286, was prosperous, peaceful, and, in retrospect, the high watermark of medieval Scottish royal power. When he rode off into a stormy night on March 18, 1286, and fell from his horse on the Fife coast near Kinghorn, he left behind a kingdom without a clear heir and a political situation without a clear resolution. The succession dispute that followed was the first act of a conflict that would define Scottish history for generations. Alexander's only potential heir was his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, the daughter of his daughter who had married the King of Norway. Margaret was 4 years old and in Norway. Edward I of England, who was the most powerful monarch in Britain, had already arranged a marriage between Margaret and his own son. The plan, not necessarily malevolent in conception, was for the kingdoms of England and Scotland to be united through the marriage of their heirs. Margaret died in Orkney in 1290, and on her way to Scotland, before the plan could be executed. She was 7 years old. Now there was no heir at all. 13 separate claimants came forward. The Scottish political community, the nobles, bishops, and magnates who constituted the governing class, invited Edward I to adjudicate between them rather than fight a civil war to settle the question. This was not naivety. Edward had a reputation as a brilliant legal mind and had no obvious conflict of interest. They asked him to judge, and they agreed in advance to accept his judgment. But they also insisted he acknowledge Scottish sovereignty, that Scotland was a kingdom not subject to England. Before he began, Edward's response to this condition was characteristic. He accepted it in a way that left him free to ignore it, and he proceeded to investigate the claims with genuine legal thoroughness and genuine political self-interest simultaneously. He chose John Balliol, who had the strongest legal claim, in November 1292. He then immediately proceeded to treat Balliol not as the sovereign king of an independent Scotland, but as a vassal owing personal service and legal submission to the English crown. Balliol endured this for 4 years. In 1296, Scottish magnates, who had had enough of Edward's demands, formed the Council of 12, effectively a government committee that stripped Balliol of executive authority and concluded a defensive alliance with France, the first formal expression of what became the Auld Alliance. Edward invaded. Balliol's resistance collapsed. At Montrose, in a ceremony of calculated humiliation, and Balliol was stripped of his royal regalia and forced to renounce his kingship. The Scottish coat of arms was literally torn from his surcoat. Tuum tabard. Empty coat. Edinburgh Castle fell to Edward in June 1296, after a siege of approximately 3 days. The English siege engines, the same technology that Edward had deployed so effectively in Wales, made short work of the castle's medieval walls. The garrison surrendered. An English constable was installed. What followed was not merely a military occupation, but an administrative one. The English used Edinburgh as the headquarters of their governance of Scotland. Scottish records were taken south to London, including the Stone of Destiny, the ancient coronation stone, which was removed from Scone and installed in Westminster Abbey, where it remained until 1996. The Ragman Rolls, documents by which Scottish nobles swore fealty to Edward, were processed through Edinburgh. The castle was the centre of a colonial administration. Dr. Fiona Watson, whose study of Edward I and Scotland is among the most authoritative assessments of this period, does not soften the characterization. Edward's administration of Scotland after 1296 was colonial in its methods and its intentions. He did not aim to rule Scotland as a kingdom with its own traditions and institutions. He aimed to absorb Scotland into a unified Britain under English domination. The castle at Edinburgh was the physical headquarters of this project. The constables he installed were English. The records were kept in English. The language of administration was the language of the occupier. For the next 18 years, the Edinburgh Castle was held by English forces, with one brief interruption when a Scottish force under William Wallace's successors took it temporarily in 1299 or 1300. The precise date is disputed, and the occupation was short. Otherwise, the castle flew the English flag. The garrison was English. The constable was English. The administrative documents generated there were English crown documents. Robert the Bruce, who had claimed the Scottish throne in 1306 and spent years fighting both the English and Scottish factions opposed to his claim, understood that Edinburgh Castle in English hands was an anchor of English power in Scotland. It had to be removed, but it had to be removed without the siege machinery that would have been needed for a conventional assault. And because Bruce did not have siege machinery and could not sustain the prolonged campaigns that conventional sieges required, his strategy throughout the Wars of Independence was consistent: take English-held Scottish castles by stealth, cunning, or surprise, and then demolish them so they could not be used by the English again. Most of the great Scottish castles fell to Bruce by one or another of these methods and were subsequently demolished to prevent reuse. Edinburgh was the hardest problem. The rock seemed impregnable. The garrison was large enough to repel any direct assault. The steep sides seemed to make night climbing impossible. Seemed. Chapter 3. The Night Climb, 1314. And the legend that isn't a legend. Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray, was Robert the Bruce's nephew and one of his most capable commanders. He was also, earlier in the wars, one of the most significant Scottish noble defections to the English side. He had been captured by Bruce in 1308, changed allegiance, and become one of Bruce's most trusted lieutenants. His career arc is itself a corrective to the simple national myth. The Wars of Independence were not cleanly divided between Scottish patriots and English oppressors. They were fought across a landscape of shifting allegiances, personal calculation, and evolving political conviction. In early 1314, Bruce tasked Randolph with taking Edinburgh Castle. By any conventional military logic, this was impossible. The castle was well garrisoned, the walls were intact, and had been maintained by the English administration for 18 years, and the rock face on three sides dropped sheer for 60 meters. A direct assault would have been suicidal. A prolonged siege would have required resources and time that Bruce's campaign strategy could not accommodate. Randolph found a man named William Francis. Francis had grown up near the castle. As a young man, the sources are vague about exactly when, he had developed the habit of climbing down the north face of the rock at night to visit a woman in the town, and climbing back up before dawn. He had done it often enough that he knew the route by feel, in darkness, in all weathers. He knew where the handholds were. He knew which sections required a specific technique. He knew, crucially, and that the garrison did not watch the north face, because nobody believed it was climbable. Francis offered to lead a party up the north face at night. Randolph accepted. On the night of March 14th, 1314, roughly 3 months before the decisive engagement at Bannockburn, Randolph led a party of approximately 30 men up the north face of Castle Rock in complete darkness. Francis went first, finding the route from memory. 30 men followed, in single file, clinging to holds on a rock face that drops 60 meters to the ground below. If any of them slipped, if any of them dislodged a stone that fell and woke the garrison below, if the garrison happened to check the north wall at any point during the climb, none of these things happened. They made it to the wall walk at the top. The garrison had concentrated on the eastern approach, the only approach anyone thought needed watching, were caught completely by surprise. A small fight, the castle taken. And then, per Bruce's standing orders, systematically demolished. The walls were thrown down, the fortifications were slighted. The English would not be able to use Edinburgh Castle as a base again. This is not legend, it is documented history. And the fact that it is documented history is itself the key to understanding the myth that contradicts it. John Barbour wrote his epic poem The Bruce in the 1370s, approximately 60 years after the events. Barbour was a clerk in royal service, likely with access to survivors or those who had known survivors, or writing in a tradition of heroic verse that celebrated Bruce's campaigns for a Scottish political community that had emerged from them. He was not writing academic history. He was writing something closer to national epic, glorifying, celebrating, shaping the past into usable political memory. Dr. Fiona Watson has assessed the Barbour account with appropriate scholarly caution. Barbour is a poetic source, not a chronicle, and historians use him carefully. But the core of the 1314 episode, a small force climbing the north face of Castle Rock, guided by someone who knew the route, catching the garrison by surprise, is entirely plausible militarily and consistent with what we know of Bruce's methods across multiple other operations. The detail about Francis's nocturnal personal reasons for knowing the route is the kind of humanizing, a slightly embarrassing detail that tends to preserve genuine memory rather than invented legend. Made-up stories are usually cleaner. They don't give the hero a reason to know the route that involves a woman he was secretly visiting. So the 1314 episode is both historically attested and one of the most celebrated moments in Scottish national memory, the subject of school lessons, commemorations, popular histories. Which makes what comes next genuinely puzzling. The famous claim about Edinburgh Castle, that it has never been taken by storm, is false. The 1314 event directly refutes it. And the 1341 recapture by William Douglas, who disguised his men as merchants delivering supplies and produced weapons once the gates were open, refutes it a second time. Both events are well documented. Both are celebrated in Scottish historical culture, and neither has been sufficient to dislodge the claim. This coexistence of documented refutation and persistent myth tells you something important about how national memory works. The myth and the history it contradicts do not occupy the same cultural category. The never-been-taken claim operates as a symbol, a compressed statement about Scottish resilience, about the castle's association with Scottish identity, about permanence and unconquerability. The 1314 night climb operates as a heroic military narrative, a story of courage and ingenuity. These are different cultural objects, serving different purposes. They do not interact because they are not experienced as contradictory. One is national identity. The other is a story about one particular night. The 1745 Jacobite failure reinforces the myth without being examined in the same frame. The castle held against Bonnie Prince Charlie's forces. This is cited as evidence of impregnability. But the Jacobites lacked siege artillery. With the guns that Cromwell used in 1650, the result would have been different. The castle's resistance in 1745 was not a product of its defensive perfection, but of its besiegers' logistical limitations. Every nation does this. Every national culture has monuments around which historical complexity is suppressed in favor of symbolic coherence. Edinburgh Castle is Scotland's most visible example. The question worth asking is not why the myth exists. That is obvious. But what is lost when it is never challenged? Chapter 4. The Black Dinner, 1440. Now we arrive at the event that inspired the Red Wedding, and the year is 1440. The King of Scotland is James II. He is 10 years old. James II became king in 1437 when his father, James I, was assassinated in Perth, stabbed multiple times in an attempted coup by a faction of disaffected nobles who had calculated, incorrectly, that they could seize power with the king dead. The coup failed politically, but succeeded in its immediate object. James I died. His son, a child of 6, became James II of Scotland. James I himself had spent 18 years as a prisoner of the English crown before being ransomed and returned to Scotland. He was a capable and energetic king who had spent his adult captivity writing poetry, absorbing English administrative methods, and developing a sophisticated understanding of how royal power worked, and how vulnerable it was to noble faction. When he returned to Scotland in 1424, he immediately began suppressing the great noble families that had accumulated power during his absence. He was murdered in 1437 by a faction of exactly those nobles, in a conspiracy that included members of the Albany Stuarts, a branch of the royal family that had provided the regents during James's captivity and that had accumulated wealth and power at the crown's expense. The murder of James I was planned and executed with care. The conspirators blocked the drains of the chamber where he was sleeping to prevent escape, entered at night, and killed him after a struggle. They miscalculated the political response. The Scottish political community did not rally to them, and the conspirators were captured, tried, and executed with a thoroughness that was itself deliberately exemplary. James's queen, Joan Beaufort, who had been wounded in the attack, supervised the executions personally. Several of the conspirators died by particularly prolonged methods, in a demonstration that regicide would be punished without mercy. The child James II inherited a kingdom in which political murder had just demonstrated its capacity to reshape the succession, and in which the great noble families were barely chastened. A regency meant a competition among those families for control of the child king and the patronage that flowed from him. In 1440, that competition had produced a working alliance between Sir William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor, and Sir Alexander Livingston, who controlled physical access to the king. Between them, they ran Scotland. The problem was the Douglas family. In the Black Douglases, distinguished from the Red Douglas line by historians, though contemporaries often simply called them Douglases, were the most powerful noble family in Scotland. Their territories sprawled across the south of the country, from the borders through Galloway. Their income exceeded that of many independent European lords. Their military capacity, at full mobilization, could challenge the crown itself. In the power vacuum of a royal minority, with the regency dominated by Crichton and Livingston rather than by themselves, the Douglases were the obvious threat to whoever held control. The 6th Earl of Douglas had recently died. His heir was William, the young 6th Earl, a teenager, perhaps 16. With him was his younger brother David, around 14. Both were the heirs to vast Douglas power and vast Douglas connections, and both were, to Crichton and Livingston, existential threats. Not because of anything they had done, but because of what they were. The solution was simple and monstrous. They invited the Douglas boys to dine with the king at Edinburgh Castle. The invitation was framed as conciliatory, an opportunity for the young earl to take his rightful place at court, for the faction that had dominated the regency to demonstrate its openness to Douglas participation. Safe conduct was explicitly guaranteed. The boys came. They rode to Edinburgh with a small retinue, entered the castle, and sat down at table with the 10-year-old king in the Great Hall. What happened next is recorded in multiple sources. The most vivid account appears in the Auchinleck Chronicle, a near-contemporary document that describes the meal proceeding normally until a black bull's head was placed on the table. In Scotland of this period, the symbolism was unmistakable. A black bull's head placed before a guest at a feast was a death signal. It meant the recipient was condemned. The gesture had sufficient cultural currency that the Douglas boys understood immediately what it meant. The king, 10 years old, seated at the head of his own table, reportedly wept and begged for the boys' lives. He was King of Scotland. He was weeping. He could do nothing. He was 10 years old, and the men in the room were his regents, his guardians, the men who controlled his government, and they had already decided. William and David Douglas were dragged from the table, and they were given a summary trial. The sources differ on how cursory it was, but none suggest it had any real legal substance. They were beheaded in the courtyard of Edinburgh Castle that night. Dr. Fiona Watson has written extensively on the political context of the Black Dinner. The Black Dinner was political murder dressed as justice. Crichton and Livingston had no legitimate grounds to execute the Douglas boys. William Douglas had committed no crime against the crown. What they had was power, and they used it. The king's presence was essential to the plan. It gave the executions the appearance of royal sanction, while ensuring that the boy king himself could not effectively prevent it. His distress, if the account is accurate, was real and beside the point. He was a prop in someone else's scheme, being used to provide cover for an act of political murder driven by ambition and greed. The Game of Thrones parallel is genuine. George R.R. Martin has acknowledged in interviews that the Red Wedding drew on Scottish history, specifically on the Black Dinner and on the massacre of Glencoe in 1692, as inspirations for the violation of guest right that makes the Red Wedding so viscerally shocking. The parallel is real. In both the fiction and the history, hospitality is weaponized. The warmth of an invitation is converted into a mechanism of murder, and the horror derives from the gap between the social contract of the shared table and the violence that follows. But the parallel has meaningful limits. In the Red Wedding, the killers have clear strategic motivations. They are eliminating a military threat that genuinely endangers them. In Edinburgh Castle in 1440, the Douglas boys were killed not because of an imminent threat, but because of a potential one. They were killed for their family name, for the power they would inherit, for the threat they might pose at some future point if they were allowed to mature into the resources behind them. They were teenagers. They were killed for what they might become. The Black Dinner did not destroy the Douglas family. It enraged it. The surviving Douglases, cousins, allies, a network of clients across southern Scotland, did not forget. The feud that followed would consume Scottish politics for the next 15 years and would ultimately be resolved by the child who had wept at the table. Grown up now, armed with artillery, and utterly without mercy toward the family whose boys he had been unable to save. Chapter 5. The Canon King and the Douglas Wars, 1440 to 1460. James II of Scotland grew up with the Black Dinner in his memory, and the Douglas problem unresolved. He came of age as king in the late 1440s. The regency ended. He took personal control of the government, and he found himself ruling a kingdom in which the Douglas family, reconstituted under the 8th Earl, William Douglas, was as powerful as before, in some ways more so, with a network of alliances across the Scottish nobility that made them effectively a state within the state. The 8th Earl was a man of extraordinary political reach. He had consolidated Douglas control over a swathe of southern Scotland that stretched from Dumfries to the borders to Galloway. His family connections reached into every corner of Scottish noble society. His income from Douglas lands exceeded that of many European princes. He had contracted bonds of mutual support, maintenance, in the contemporary legal terminology, with the Earls of Crawford and Ross, creating a confederation of noble power that made him, collectively with his allies, the most powerful political force in Scotland after the Crown. James II was not the kind of king to accept this quietly. He had grown up watching his regents maneuver around great nobles rather than confront them. He had seen, from his childhood seat at that table in 1440, what powerful men did with impunity when a king was too young to stop them. He had no intention of presiding over a repeat. The confrontation between James II and the 8th Earl of Douglas has a moment of extraordinary violence at its center. In February 1452, James II personally invited William Douglas, the 8th Earl, to Stirling Castle under a guarantee of safe conduct for discussions about the Earl's alliance with other powerful nobles that James viewed as treasonous. The meeting went badly. James demanded that Douglas break the alliance. Douglas refused. James, by various accounts, produced a knife and stabbed Douglas himself. His attendants joined in. Douglas was stabbed multiple times and thrown from the window. It is worth pausing on this. The King of Scotland personally murdered his most powerful subject in his own castle, under a guarantee of safe conduct that he had issued himself. He then justified it, argued with genuine legal creativity that Douglas's treasonous alliances had forfeited his right to the protection of the safe conduct. The Scottish Parliament, and after some deliberation, accepted this argument. James faced no legal consequences. The deliberations of the Parliament on this question tell us something important about the political realities of 15th-century Scotland. The nobles who might have been expected to resist the king's logic, on the grounds that if royal safe conducts could be unilaterally voided, none of them were safe, instead accepted it. Partly because Douglas himself had not been universally popular among his fellow nobles, partly because the alternative, condemning the king, was politically catastrophic in ways nobody wanted to trigger, and partly because Douglas's own behavior, his defiance of royal authority, his building of an alternative power structure within the kingdom, had genuinely threatened the political order from which the other nobles also benefited. The Douglas Wars that followed lasted years. The Douglas family, now led by James Douglas, the 9th and final Earl, fought the crown, allied with England, raided across the country. James II fought back with a combination of military force, political maneuvering, and the strategic use of artillery. He was fascinated by artillery. The new gunpowder technology that was rendering medieval castle walls obsolete was something James II understood instinctively and embraced enthusiastically. He imported artillery from Flanders, particularly from the workshops that were producing some of the most advanced guns in Europe. He built up a siege train that was among the most capable in Northern Europe. This was not merely a hobby. Artillery was the decisive military technology of the age. The castles that had held against conventional siege methods for centuries were falling within days to concentrated cannon fire. The Douglas power was rooted partly in the defensibility of their strongholds, the great castles of the South that had sheltered Douglas power for generations. Guns changed that equation. A lord whose castle walls could be reduced in a week had a different calculation to make about resistance. The Douglas power was broken in 1455. The 9th Earl was forfeited. The Black Douglas line was extinguished as a political force. Their vast estates were distributed among the crown and its allies. The Douglas castles were taken. For the first time in generations, the crown had no rival that could match it militarily. James II had achieved something that Scottish kings had been attempting for decades: a monarchy genuinely dominant over the nobility. The magnate power that had produced the Black Dinner, that had used a child king as a cover for private murder, had been defeated. Not by patience or diplomacy, but by violence, by artillery, and by a king who had learned early exactly what power without constraint looked like, and had decided to hold it himself. He did not live to enjoy the achievement. In 1460, James II laid siege to Roxburgh Castle, a significant border fortress held by the English, which the Scots had been trying to recover for years. His artillery was there, his entire siege train. He was present at the guns, as he always was, because he was the kind of king who stood at the front rather than directed from the rear. On August 3, 1460, one of the cannons exploded next to him. At the technical failure, probably a flaw in the casting or excessive powder charge or a structural weakness in the barrel that had been used too many times, produced a catastrophic detonation. Fragments of iron and burning debris struck the king. James II, King of Scotland, was killed by his own canon at the age of 29. Dr. Michael Brown of the University of St. Andrews, whose work on James II is the most detailed modern study of the reign, notes the significance of the manner of death. James II was a hands-on military commander in ways that were both courageous and reckless. His presence at Roxburgh was consistent with his style of kingship. He led from the front, he involved himself personally in military operations, he wanted to be where the action was. The cannon that killed him was probably a gift from his wife's family in Flanders, one of the new large-bore weapons that he had been acquiring to strengthen his siege capability. The technology that had made him dangerous to his enemies, that had broken the Douglas power, that had allowed him to dominate the Scottish nobility in ways his predecessors could not. It killed him instead. Medieval history is full of such reversals, but few as stark as this one. James II left a son, another James, who became James III at the age of 9. Another child king, another minority, another period of noble competition for control of the government. The structural vulnerability of a monarchy that depended entirely on the personal capacity of whoever happened to be on the throne remained. James II had broken one great noble family. No, the system that produced great noble families remained intact. Edinburgh Castle through this entire period, the Black Dinner, the Douglas Wars, the artillery campaigns, was functioning primarily as a military installation and weapons storage facility. It was not a royal residence in any comfortable sense. The kings of Scotland who could afford to be were elsewhere, at Stirling, at Linlithgow, at the pleasanter royal palaces that offered more light, more warmth, and less exposure to the North Sea wind than a castle on a volcanic plug 80 meters above the city. Edinburgh Castle was where you went when you needed a fortress. The rest of the time, you went somewhere better. For Chapter 6, The Reformations and the Lang Siege, 1460 to 1573. The century between the death of James II and the extraordinary episode known as the Lang Siege was one of the most turbulent in Scottish history, and Edinburgh Castle was at the center of almost all of it. James III was assassinated, effectively, since he died fleeing after his own nobles defeated him at the Battle of Soggyburn in 1488. The specific circumstances of his death remain murky. He was found wounded and sheltering in a mill. A man presenting himself as a priest came to give last rites, and instead stabbed him. Whether the assassin was acting on orders from the victorious noble faction is not known. The nobles had already deposed him in favor of his son. The killing was probably opportunistic, probably covered up, so probably not ordered, but certainly not investigated. James III was buried at Cambuskenneth Abbey, and the political establishment moved on. James IV was killed at Flodden in 1513, leading the largest Scottish army ever assembled into a catastrophic defeat by the English, at which approximately 10,000 Scots died, including the king himself and most of the Scottish nobility. Flodden was not a siege or a castle episode. It was a field battle, lost through a combination of tactical errors, terrain disadvantage, and the superior discipline of the English forces under the Earl of Surrey. But its consequences shaped everything that followed, including the political context in which the Protestant Reformation reached Scotland. James V died in 1542, at the age of 30, and of what contemporaries described as a broken heart after the defeat at Solway Moss. The sources suggest something more like physical collapse, possibly dysentery aggravated by despair. He had spent his reign fighting against English pressure, Catholic intransigence, and noble factionalism in ways that left him personally isolated and politically exhausted. His heir was his daughter, born 6 days before his death. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Queen of Scotland from the age of 6 days. Mary's reign, her personal reign, from her return to Scotland from France in 1561 to her abdication in 1567, is one of the most written about periods in Scottish history, and one of the most easily mythologized. She was beautiful, by the accounts of the time. She was Catholic, in a country that had undergone a Protestant Reformation of exceptional violence and speed. The Scottish Reformation of 1560 had been driven partly by genuine religious conviction, partly by English money and support, and partly by the political interests of a noble class that saw church property as the solution to chronic financial problems. She was a queen in an age that found female rule uncomfortable and expressed this discomfort through theological argument. She also made catastrophic political choices. Her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, vain, ambitious, politically incompetent, had produced a son, the future James VI, before collapsing into mutual hostility. Darnley was murdered at Kirkfield in February 1567, in circumstances that strongly implicated Mary's subsequent husband, James Hepburn, as Earl of Bothwell. Whether Mary knew in advance about the murder, whether she commissioned it, consented to it, or was genuinely ignorant, has been argued by historians for 4.5 centuries without resolution. The contemporary political establishment chose to believe the worst. Mary was forced to abdicate in favor of her infant son in July 1567 and fled to England the following year, beginning the 18-year imprisonment that ended at Fotheringhay Castle in February 1587. Edinburgh Castle connects to Mary's story most directly through the birth of her son in the castle in June 1566. Mary chose Edinburgh Castle for the birth specifically because it was the most defensible location available. She had reason to fear for her safety. She had witnessed the murder of her secretary, David Rizzio, in her own apartments at Holyrood the previous year, stabbed over 50 times in her presence while she was 6 months pregnant. The castle was not comfortable. It was, at least, defensible. The future James VI was born in a small room in the castle that can still be visited today. He was king before he could walk. The Lang Siege of 1571 to 1573 was the castle's last significant military action for nearly a century, and one of the most politically complex episodes in its history. After Mary's abdication, Scotland was divided between those who supported the infant King James VI, the king's men, Protestant, pro-English, and those who remained loyal to Mary. The Queen's men, a mixed coalition of Catholic loyalists, and nobles who had benefited from Mary's patronage, and those who simply considered her abdication illegitimate. Edinburgh Castle was held by the Queen's men under Sir William Kirkcaldy of Grange, one of the most capable soldiers of his generation, a man who had fought on multiple sides across a career that spanned the religious wars of mid-century Europe. Kirkcaldy held the castle for over 2 years. He was an excellent commander, and the castle was well supplied, at least initially. The king's men besieged from below, but lacked the artillery to force the issue. The stalemate continued through 1571 and into 1572, punctuated by sorties, skirmishes, and the slow attrition of resources on both sides. The turning point came when England intervened. Elizabeth I's government, which had a consistent strategic interest in a Protestant, a pro-English government in Scotland, sent artillery to the king's men. Specifically, they sent guns capable of reducing the castle's medieval walls, which no previous besieging force in Scotland had possessed. The English guns began their work in May 1573. Within 2 weeks, they had breached the walls in multiple places. The collapse of David's Tower, the great medieval tower that had defined the castle's profile for 3 centuries, was the decisive moment. The garrison could not repair the damage fast enough. Kirkcaldy negotiated surrender. He was promised his life. The promise was not kept. He was hanged outside Edinburgh that August. His co-commander, the Secretary of State William Maitland of Lethington, one of the most sophisticated political minds in 16th-century Scotland, died in prison before he could be executed, possibly by his own hand. The Lang siege left Edinburgh Castle in serious physical disrepair. The reconstruction that followed created many of the features tourists see today. The Half Moon Battery, the great semicircular artillery platform that dominates the east face of the castle when viewed from the Royal Mile, was built directly on the ruins of David's Tower. It is the most photographed part of the castle. It is also, precisely, the record of the castle's most significant defeat. An English-supported bombardment that destroyed the structure at its center and required a completely new architectural solution. The picturesque battery that appears on 1,000 postcards is built on rubble. The castle was redesigned in the aftermath to reflect the realities of gunpowder warfare. Lower walls, thicker, better angled, bastions rather than towers. The geometry of early modern fortification replacing the geometry of medieval castle design. Edinburgh Castle in its current form is substantially a product of this post-1573 reconstruction, which means it is substantially a product of an English military intervention in Scottish politics, built on the ruins that English guns created. Chapter 7. The Union and the Forgotten Jewels, 1603 to 1818. In 1603, James VI of Scotland became James I of England, and departed Edinburgh for London within weeks. He returned to Scotland once, in 1617, for a visit of several months that his English courtiers found uncomfortable, and his Scottish subjects found disappointingly brief. The union of the crowns had moved the centre of political gravity decisively south. Scotland remained a separate kingdom with its own parliament and its own legal system and its own church. These distinctions mattered enormously and would be fought over bitterly across the 17th century. But its king lived in London, conducted his primary political business from London, and drew his court, his favourites, and increasingly his cultural reference points from England. And Edinburgh Castle's significance began to shift in this period from political centre to military installation. It remained the headquarters of whatever military force the Crown maintained in Scotland. It remained a prison, and a significant one. The religious wars of the 17th century produced prisoners in quantity. The Covenanters, Scottish Presbyterians who opposed the attempts of Charles I and then Charles II to impose Episcopalian governance on the Church of Scotland, were imprisoned in the castle across multiple phases of the conflict. The Covenant itself was signed in Edinburgh in 1638, in a moment of mass political mobilization that surprised even its organizers. The Wars of the Three Kingdoms, the interlocking conflicts of the 1640s and 1650s that included the English Civil War, the Scottish Covenanting Wars, and the Irish Confederate Wars, produced Scottish military factions that allied with, fought against, and changed their relationship with the English Parliament multiple times in the space of a decade. After the restoration of Charles II in 1660, the Covenanting tradition was suppressed with sustained violence. Ministers who refused to accept Episcopalian governance were ejected from their churches. Those who continued to preach, in fields and hillsides, in the illegal gatherings called conventicles, were prosecuted. The killing time of the early 1680s saw summary executions of Covenanters across southern Scotland. The castle was the final destination for many of those captured. In 1679, and following the Battle of Bothwell Brig, in which a Covenanting army was crushed by government forces under the Duke of Monmouth, over 1,200 prisoners were marched to Edinburgh and confined in the castle's Greyfriars churchyard, adjacent to the Castle Rock. They were held through the winter with inadequate shelter and food. Many died. Several hundred were subsequently transported to the American colonies as indentured laborers. The survivors who were neither transported nor tried were eventually released. The episode left a deep scar in Scottish Presbyterian memory and contributed to the political conditions that produced the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the final collapse of Stuart royal power. And the Act of Union of 1707, which merged the Scottish and English parliaments into the Parliament of Great Britain, was the culminating moment of a process that had been building since 1603, accelerated by the political crises of the 17th century, and completed through a combination of English political pressure, Scottish economic calculation, and what many contemporaries described as bribery. The Scottish Parliament that voted itself out of existence in 1707 was not acting under direct military coercion, but the political and economic incentives shaping the vote were not subtle. Scotland's Darien scheme, an attempt to establish a Scottish colonial presence in Panama, had collapsed disastrously in 1698 and 1699, costing investors enormous sums and demonstrating Scotland's inability to sustain colonial enterprise without English support or acquiescence. The English Navigation Acts excluded Scottish merchants from English colonial markets. The offer of full access to English trade in exchange for parliamentary union was economically compelling regardless of what one thought about it politically. Daniel Defoe, the English writer who would later produce Robinson Crusoe, was in Edinburgh in 1706 and 1707 as an English government agent, reporting on Scottish political opinion and working to influence it in favor of union. His letters home describe a Scottish population that was, in the streets, mostly hostile to union, while the Scottish Parliament moved toward it. "I never saw a nation so universally wild," he wrote to his employer, Robert Harley. "See, the common people are stark mad." The Parliament passed the Union anyway. In 1707, the honours of Scotland, the Scottish crown jewels, the oldest crown jewels in Britain and among the oldest in Europe, were sealed inside a room in Edinburgh Castle. They were not stored with care and documented for future retrieval. They were sealed, locked behind a door in the Crown Room, which was then itself locked. The Crown of Scotland, made in its current form for James V in 1540, incorporating a circlet of Scottish gold that may be significantly older, was inside. The sceptre, presented to James IV by Pope Alexander VI in 1494, was inside. The sword of state, also a papal gift, was inside. Objects that had been used at every Scottish coronation for centuries, that represented the physical continuity of Scottish royal sovereignty, were put in a room and the door was locked. And then no one remembered where the key was. 111 years passed. In 1818, Sir Walter Scott organized an official search. He had become convinced through his historical research that the honours still existed somewhere in the castle. He petitioned the Prince Regent for permission to investigate. A commission was appointed. They went to the castle. They found the Crown Room. They found the door. They eventually found or forced their way through it. They found the chest inside. They opened the chest. The crown was there. The sceptre was there. The sword of state was there. Intact. Untouched. Still in the positions they had been left in 111 years earlier. And Scott's own account of the moment has been quoted extensively. He describes the emotional response of everyone present as being beyond what any of them had anticipated. Hardened political figures, military men, practical administrators, they wept. They held the crown of Scotland, which had not been touched since the Act of Union. And something happened in that room that Scott, who made his living finding words for things, struggled to describe precisely. Dr. Rosalind Marshall has written on the honours history with characteristic precision. The 111 years during which the honours were sealed away is not simply bureaucratic negligence. It reflects the degree to which Scottish national sovereignty had been not just suppressed, but structurally eliminated after the Union. There was no occasion on which the honours would be used, and because there was no Scottish coronation, no Scottish Parliament, no ceremony that required them. Sealing them away was both practically logical and symbolically devastating. What Scott found in 1818 was not just 3 old objects. He found the physical form of Scottish sovereignty, preserved in darkness, intact, waiting for a Scotland that had been told, and had half believed, that it no longer existed. Scott had the honours put on display in the castle. They remain there today. They are visited by over 1 million people a year. They are the most affecting objects in the castle, and not only because they are beautiful, which they are affecting because of what the 111 years mean, because of what it means that they were found. Chapter 8. The Castle in Modern Scotland, 1818 to present. The discovery of the honours in 1818 was the beginning of a process that would transform Edinburgh Castle from a military installation into a national symbol. Scott himself was the primary architect of this transformation. His influence on how Scotland understood and presented itself in the 19th century cannot be overstated. His novels, Waverley, Rob Roy, The Heart of Midlothian, created a romantic version of Scottish history that was immediately and globally successful. His organization of the visit of George IV to Edinburgh in 1822, the first visit by a British monarch to Scotland in over a century, produced the tartan and Highland pageant version of Scottish identity that has influenced tourism and national self-presentation ever since. And this version of Scottish identity was, like the Men of Harlech myth in Wales, substantially constructed from historical material arranged to serve contemporary purposes. The tartans that George IV wore in 1822, presented as ancient clan traditions, were largely recent inventions. Many clan tartans had been standardized or invented by the textile industry within the previous generation. The Highland culture that Scott celebrated as the authentic heart of Scotland had been systematically destroyed after Culloden. The clan system had been abolished. The Highland dress had been banned. Gaelic-speaking communities had been subjected to sustained cultural and economic pressure. On celebrating it as Scotland's essence, simultaneously romanticized a suppressed culture and neatly avoided the lowland urban realities of industrial Scotland, where most Scots actually lived. Edinburgh Castle was central to this romantic vision. It was visually magnificent. It had centuries of dramatic history. It was associated with Mary, Queen of Scots, always a figure of romantic sympathy, whatever the complications of the actual history, and now with the rediscovered honours. It was the obvious symbol. The castle was gradually handed over from purely military to mixed civil-military use through the later 19th and 20th centuries. This transition was not seamless. The castle remained an active British Army garrison through the Second World War, housing military headquarters and at various points sheltering important people and important documents from German bombing. The military presence continued after the war. The castle houses regimental museums, a military chapel, and the Scottish National War Memorial, and Army personnel remain stationed there. The Scottish National War Memorial, built inside the castle after the First World War, is one of the most visited and emotionally significant spaces in Scotland. A commemoration of Scottish soldiers who died in a war fought under a British flag, in which Scottish identity and British identity coexisted in complicated and not always comfortable ways. The memorial was designed by Robert Lorimer and completed in 1927. It commemorates approximately 150,000 Scots who died in the First World War. They died as British soldiers, in British units, under British command, for British strategic objectives. The memorial commemorates them as Scots. The tension between these two identities is present in every line of the building's design and was not lost on the people who built it. There is another history inside Edinburgh Castle that the tourist literature handles briefly. The Napoleonic prisoners. Between 1811 and 1814, approximately 1,000 French and Allied prisoners of war were held in the castle's lower vaults, the same medieval cellars that had been used for storage, ammunition, and occasional imprisonment since the 14th century. The conditions were poor. The vaults were cold, damp, and poorly ventilated. The prisoners, mostly sailors and soldiers captured in the naval and land campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars, were given basic rations and minimal facilities. Many carved into the stonework of their cells. The carvings are still there. They include names, dates, ships' names, decorative motifs, playing card suits, human figures. They are among the most intimate historical artifacts in the castle. Direct traces of real human beings imprisoned in these walls, marking their presence in the only way available to them. The tattoo, the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo, staged on the castle esplanade each August, is itself a kind of compression of the castle's historical complexity. It attracts over 200,000 spectators annually and is broadcast to audiences of over 100 million worldwide. It is simultaneously a celebration of Scottish military tradition, a British military spectacle, an international variety performance featuring pipe bands and military units from dozens of countries, and a major commercial event that generates significant revenue for the Edinburgh economy. Scottish pipe bands march alongside Swiss guards and Jordanian military musicians. The military tradition being celebrated is Scottish in its cultural symbolism and British in its institutional structure. Whether this represents the successful integration of Scottish identity within a broader framework or the effective absorption of Scottish distinctiveness into a British entertainment product depends again on your politics. The Scottish independence debate has given Edinburgh Castle a political dimension it had not carried so explicitly since the Jacobite period. The 2014 independence referendum, in which 55% of Scottish voters chose to remain in the United Kingdom, did not resolve the underlying questions, particularly after the 2016 Brexit referendum, in which Scotland voted 62% to remain in the European Union, while the UK as a whole voted to leave. The divergence between Scottish and UK-wide political preferences has sustained independence as a live political question. In this context, Edinburgh Castle functions differently, depending on which political conversation you are in. For Scottish nationalists, it represents both the ancient sovereignty that Scotland is reclaiming and the colonial suppression that made reclaiming necessary. For Unionists, it represents the shared history of a partnership in which both Scotland and England have been full participants. For the 2 million tourists who visit annually, most of them neither Scottish nor especially engaged with Scottish constitutional politics, it represents a photogenic medieval fortress with a dramatic history and a good gift shop. All of these things are simultaneously true. The castle contains all of them. It has for 7 centuries. The visitor experience today reflects this complexity imperfectly. The castle is managed by Historic Environment Scotland, which has made genuine efforts in recent years to present the fuller history rather than the simplified nationalist version. The information boards in the dungeons acknowledge the Covenanter prisoners. The Napoleonic vaults are interpreted as a prison space, not simply as an architectural curiosity. Since the story of the honors includes the 111 years of forgetting as well as the drama of the discovery. But the gravitational pull toward the symbol is powerful, and commercial pressures reinforce it. The gift shop sells more shortbread tins than books about Edward I's administrative records. The audio guides emphasize the most dramatic episodes over the most instructive ones. The queues are longest for the honors and the Great Hall. The lower vaults, where prisoners carved their names, attract fewer visitors and less dwell time. Dr. David Brun, professor of Scottish history at the University of Glasgow, who has studied how Edinburgh Castle has functioned in constructions of Scottish national identity across multiple centuries, is clear-eyed about the tension. Edinburgh Castle is a genuinely important historical site, with a genuinely complex history. The complexity is the point. A history that includes long periods of English control, episodes of extraordinary violence carried out by Scots against Scots, the suppression of Scottish cultural identity after the Union, and the gradual recovery of that identity through the 19th and 20th centuries. This is a more instructive history than the simplified version. The simplified version gives you a symbol. The real version gives you something to think about. The question is whether the institution responsible for the site is brave enough to foreground the thing that is harder, because the harder thing is truer. The 2 million tourists who visit Edinburgh Castle annually come from across the world. They come for the views, which are genuinely spectacular. The castle commanding a panorama across the city and out to the Firth of Forth that justifies the steep entrance fee and the climb. They come for the honors, remarkable objects with centuries of history behind them. They come for the Great Hall, for the War Memorial, for the tattoo. They come for the shortbread tin version of Scotland, and they find something more complicated if they pay attention. Most do not pay close enough attention. But the complexity is there, in the stonework, in the French prisoners' carvings, in the half-moon battery built on ruins that English guns made, in the crown room door that was sealed for 111 years. It has always been there. It will continue to be there when the gift shop changes its stock, and the audio guide script is rewritten, and another generation of tourists queues in the rain for the honors. Chapter 9. What Edinburgh Castle actually is. Edinburgh Castle has been, in its long history, many things that its current presentation tends to minimize. It has been an English garrison for extended periods of the medieval era, not briefly, not marginally, but as a sustained administrative and military reality. The English kings who held it used it for the same purposes the Scottish kings used it: domination, control, the visible assertion of power over a contested landscape. The castle is not essentially Scottish in the way that its tourist presentation implies. It is essentially a fortress on a remarkable geological formation. And whoever controlled the surrounding territory controlled the fortress, regardless of what language they spoke. It has been a prison of considerable severity. The Covenanters who died in its courtyard in the 17th century, the political prisoners who spent years in its cells across the centuries, the prisoners of war who were held in its vaults during the Napoleonic Wars, French prisoners whose carvings can still be seen in the stonework of the castle's lower levels. These people are part of the castle's history in ways that the shortbread tin version cannot accommodate. It has been the site of political murders. The Black Dinner of 1440 is the most famous, but not the only occasion on which the castle's hospitality was weaponized. The history of people invited to Edinburgh Castle and killed there, or imprisoned there, or executed there, runs through the centuries with uncomfortable persistence. It has been taken multiple times. The never-taken myth is simply false, and its falseness is documented in sources that are themselves celebrated as foundational texts of Scottish national identity. Barber's Bruce, which describes the 1314 night climb, is taught in Scottish schools as a primary text of Scottish literary heritage. The contradiction between what the text says and what the myth claims has somehow never been sufficiently disruptive to dislodge the myth, and it has been the repository of a national identity that was suppressed for over a century. The honors, locked in the dark, forgotten, found by a novelist who was himself in the business of constructing romantic national identity from selective historical material. All of these things are true. They are not equally foregrounded in the visitor experience. The question that Edinburgh Castle poses, and that its current presentation cannot quite bring itself to ask directly, is a question about national identity and historical memory. If this castle spent significant portions of its medieval history as an English fortress, what does it mean for Scottish national identity that it has been adopted as the symbol of that identity? If the myths constructed around it are demonstrably false in their specifics, the castle was taken. The honors were not so much preserved as forgotten. Does the emotional truth that those myths serve survive the historical deconstruction? The answer, probably, is that it does. National identity does not require perfect historical accuracy, and it requires usable history. History that can be shaped into a narrative of collective identity, of shared experience, of belonging to something that persists through time. Edinburgh Castle, whatever the complications of its actual history, has genuinely been the site of events that shaped Scotland. The Black Dinner happened there. The honours were found there. The Lang Siege happened there. The night climb happened nearby at least, and the castle taken that night was the ancestor of the castle that stands today. But there is a cost to national myths that the myths themselves obscure. When Scottish identity is built substantially on a castle that was actually an English garrison for significant periods, or it contains a suppression of historical complexity that makes it harder to understand what the relationship between Scotland and England actually was and actually is. The relationship was not simply one of oppressor and oppressed, of English power crushing Scottish independence. It was messier, more entangled, more mutually constitutive than that. Scots participated in the building of the British Empire. Scottish soldiers garrisoned English colonies across the world. Scottish money and Scottish intellect were central to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution that made Britain the dominant global power of the 19th century. All of this is harder to see from a narrative that positions Edinburgh Castle as the embattled symbol of a nation that England tried to crush. The honours of Scotland, found in 1818, put on display, visited by millions, are themselves a metaphor that cuts both ways. They were preserved, they were found, they are real, and they are there, and they are extraordinary objects with 9 centuries of Scottish history behind them. But they were also forgotten. Lost not to English suppression, but to the institutional entropy of a union that Scotland's own ruling classes had, in many cases, eagerly embraced. The forgetting was partly a Scottish act. The finding was by a man, Scott, who was simultaneously Scotland's greatest romantic nationalist and one of the architects of Scottish integration into a British cultural framework. And the unresolved question that Edinburgh Castle poses to anyone who looks at it honestly is this. If the castle spent more of its history as an English garrison than as a Scottish stronghold, if its most famous myth is demonstrably false, if its crown jewels were forgotten for over a century, if its most dramatic episode was a scene of Scots killing Scots at the instigation of other Scots, what does it actually symbolize? And the deeper question beneath that one, who gets to decide what a national symbol means? The historians who document the complexity? The tourists who need the shortbread tin? The nationalists who need a stronghold? The unionists who need a shared heritage? The 2 million people a year who climb the rock and look out over the city and feel something that the history, however complicated, are genuinely produced in a real place over real centuries? These are not rhetorical questions. They are live political questions in Scotland right now. As the independence debate continues, and as the relationship between Scottish and British identity remains genuinely unresolved. What Edinburgh Castle symbolizes depends on which Scotland you are imagining. The Scotland that was, the Scotland that is, or the Scotland that some people want it to become. The castle does not answer this. It stands on its rock, as it has stood for 7 centuries, and it lets you project onto it whatever you need. That may be what national symbols are for, but it is not what history is for. History is for looking at the rock clearly, at the English garrisons and the Scottish murders, and the forgotten jewels, and the false myth of the unconquered castle, and the real night climb, and the real black dinner, and the child king who wept at the table and could do nothing. And understanding that the complicated truth is more interesting, more instructive, and ultimately more useful than the symbol. The French prisoners who carved their names in the lower vaults between 1811 and 1814 were not thinking about Scottish national identity. They were thinking about survival, about marking that they had existed in this place, about leaving some trace that would outlast their imprisonment, possibly outlast themselves. Their names are still in the stone. They are there alongside the honors, alongside St. Margaret's Chapel, or alongside the half-moon battery built on English rubble. They are part of what the castle is. James II wept at a table in 1440 and could not save two boys who were being killed in his name. He grew up to break the Douglas family with artillery, and was then killed by his own gun. The castle held his weapons, housed his enemies, witnessed his childhood trauma, and outlasted him by 6 centuries. Thomas Randolph climbed the north face of the rock in the dark in 1314, following a man who knew the route because he had been visiting a woman in secret. The castle he took was demolished the next day. The unconquered castle myth persists anyway. The honors sat in the dark for 111 years. A novelist found them and wept, and the people with him wept. And a nation that had been told it no longer had a self found its crown in a locked room in its own most famous castle. The 2 million tourists who walk through the gatehouse every year are standing in a place where all of this happened. Most of them don't know it. That is the darkest thing about Edinburgh Castle. Not the Black Dinner, not the Lang Siege, not the 111 years of forgotten honors. The darkest thing is how thoroughly a place can be famous, and how little that fame requires understanding what it actually is. The rock is 350 million years old. It has time to wait for us to catch up.